Reverie.
And this is Of Mountains and Men.
Ba-dum-tsh.
So as we get started today, we're coming together in this new year. It's already March, but it's crazy. So I think tonight we just wanted to talk a little bit about private property, the universal destination of goods, the order of love, like kind of thinking about some of these bigger topics that we are called to through the scriptures and through the teachings of the Catholic Church. And also just when you think about it, I think they give us a good order for how to live through the natural law. Like even for those who are not specifically Catholic, you could see where these things have a good founding in just building up a strong community and a strong like polis, like Aristotle would say. So I think we're going to try to dive into those a little bit on this episode and see where we go with that conversation. So
Yeah, I think it'll be a good conversation to have today. I mean, the Pharisees ask Jesus, like, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, love of God, and then love of neighbor. But I think if you remember the 70s, the hippie movement, the Beatles, all you need is love, 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 love.
Yeah.
And while in principle that makes sense, the question you have to ask is like, okay, well, what do you mean, first of all, by love? Okay, and are you aware of the situations in which loving actually that 70s Beatle-ish understanding of love actually harms? And
exactly.
Yeah, so there's a lot to talk about here. It would be great if love was super simple, and in actuality, it is. Love is simple, but we don't live in a simple world, I think.
Yeah.
And so that's where things get complicated.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it's really funny. I forget who I've heard this statistic from. It might have been Matt Fradd or somebody, but love is like, there's a statistic out there that love is like the most commonly used like word in music for the past like 60 years or whatever. And yet it's used in so many different ways. And most of them are not actually like authentically Christian ways when you think about it. So
are you misremembering what Matt Fradd says, or are you intentionally
I don't
censoring
remember.
it? Okay.
What do you want to share it?
Yeah, Matt Fradd, he says that there was a third-party company that analyzed all the comment sections on pornographic websites, and the word that popped up the most was the word love.
What?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my.
Yeah, so I was wondering if that's what you were alluding to, and you're like, I'm not going to say
no, but that's crazy. Wow. Yeah.
But I mean that.
But that's another example of distorting love in a way that is not truly love. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But people still think it is that. Like they call it making love, but they're like, it ain't making anything actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, good, awesome. So love, we're gonna answer the question to you guys perfectly. What is love today? And you'll understand it for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Not true. We're still struggling with it. So, Peter,
I think it's good to even launch off of the scriptures of your point that there can be a tendency to want to. We as human beings, we want things to be simple. We wish that everything were just this really straightforward, black and white, simple, like this is what you do, this is what you don't do. Okay, great. End of the episode, end of the show, we're good because now all we have to do is do that. And like on some level, that's true. So, the teachings of our Lord in the Gospels saying, do this, don't do that. Here's how you should love. Here's how you should do this thing. Great. But then there's also the realities. So like, I think it's a great example, you bringing up the Pharisees asking our Lord, what are the two greatest commandments? Love of God and love of neighbor. And that's profoundly important and 100% true. But then the question arises in our hearts, how do we do that? Because, I could say you should go love God and love your neighbor, and you could be thinking something completely different than I am. And another person, we could bring somebody else in and they could think something completely different too. And we could have many, many different ideas of what does it mean to love God and love your neighbor? And I think there's two kind of answers to that in one sense too, because on the one hand, it's true in some sense that everyone can have a different answer to that because it's going to look a little bit different for every person in each particular scenario. But then there's also some guardrails and boundaries that we can put up around that to understand how do we go about this on a more general level? Like what is the ways to love? What are the hierarchy of love? And so obviously there's first, loving God. That's the first and foremost thing. That's the hierarchy. That's the thing. And what does that mean? Obviously we could get into that. That means a lot of things about sacrifice. So even that's something that in our language today, I think has been stripped away oftentimes from the concept of love. But really in the tradition of the last couple thousand years, at least, love and sacrifice were never meant to be taken apart. They were meant to be understood together, because in order to truly love, you have to sacrifice. But then also I'm getting ahead of myself, because really we should start with what is love. And so the basic, I think of that too every time. The basic understanding is love is to will the good of the other.
Yes. Yeah. That's the definition: to will the good of the other, to desire what is best for them. If the metaphysical definition Peter gave is a little confusing, but we're going to break that down. So what does it mean, Peter, what does it mean to will, first of all, I guess?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what does it mean to will in that particular scenario, I would say would be to both desire the good for the other. So it's a desire in your heart that you have, but also, and I think this is where it's important to even ask, like, what is will? Because it's more than desire, because you could potentially not even have the desire per se, but you can make a conscious choice with your will and reason. Your intellect can consciously say, I'm going to choose to love this person for their good. Now, what is their good? Obviously, that also is an important question. And that comes down to the philosophical distinction between like an end and a means, for example, because, there's the means to something and the end of that thing. What the end is, like in Greek, the telos, meaning what it's made for or what a person is made for. And the means is how you get to that end. How does that come about? I'm blanking on a good example if you have any that you want to use real quick. But
to go back to will and then head back to good right after that.
Yeah, that's fine.
I like what you said. It was a good distinction that you made, where even if you don't want to do what is best for the person, you can make a decision with your reason and intellect too. Exactly. I'm going to will this even though I don't want to will this. Because the word want and will are related, but even if you don't want to do the good thing, like let's say I find $100 on the ground in front of a grocery store. Most people would just pocket it, and I would be tempted definitely to pocket it. But I hope that I would have the use of my faculties to not allow my desire for wealth to overtake my reasoning, and recognize someone lost $100 outside of a grocery store. They probably need this. And I would direct my will, even though I didn't want to turn that into the grocery store and say, hey, I found $100 on the ground. And someone could hyper-rationalize that and say, well, the grocery store is probably just going to pocket it too. It's like, that doesn't really matter.
And actually, I would even just to make that example easier to see why it's so important to will over the case of desire, is let's just say that you're walking behind somebody on the street and you see them drop the $100.
Yeah.
And so you know who that person is that you could give it to, but you might have a desire in you that goes, well, they didn't realize they dropped it, and that I could really use that $100.
Yep.
That's where you get into the scenario of, well, maybe you don't want to in that moment. You might not desire to give it to them. Some people might, some people might not. Yeah. But the will is where you can choose that it is a good thing to give this $100 to this person. It is right.
And if you don't choose the good in that moment, all of a sudden you're Raskolnikov and you're killing the pawnbroker in Crime and Punishment.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, so to will the good of another, what does it mean to will? Right, yeah. It's to desire, but even when you don't feel like desiring, even though when you don't want to, you still do what is best.
Yeah, it's a conscious choice that's made through reason.
Yeah. And then so the good, what we mean by the good, you did a good job explaining it. It's an end. Yeah. What is a good? It is an end. Why do I eat food? To have energy. Okay. To have energy is an end. Eating food is the means.
Exactly. There you go. Yeah. That's a good example of a means to an end. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Aristotle, who we've talked about before, says there must be an ultimate good that is sought for its own sake. Exactly. Otherwise, everything is pointless. I was literally just going over this in my morality class with my students. If there is no point to anything, it is pointless, and therefore nothing can actually be called good. So, Peter, what is the good?
Yeah, I mean, the good is God ultimately, as far as the ultimate end, the ultimate good is God. And that's where I think it's okay for us to just kind of acknowledge that and understand that this is a little bit in the context of that, of understanding that if we are pursuing, the good, if love is willing the good of the other, then it means willing that person be in relationship to God, that person be with God eventually. And so that's where, that's why you do the will. Like, that's why those two things are so important, is to define both will and good, because the good gives you the reason of why your intellect should choose in the will, why it should choose to will the good, because it is a good. And now that's, of course, the fundamental thing. And we had a whole podcast episode you could go back and listen to if you haven't, on the good and what different goods are and various things like that. So I don't think we need to go into a ton of detail on that right now.
Right.
We can kind of presuppose on some level. You can always go back and listen if you need to, but of that we're talking about willing the good of the other, and that foundationally and fundamentally means that love is about willing that someone be in relation to God.
Yeah. And honestly, just to point out how this simple definition gets complicated so quickly, is in the beginning of the podcast, I referenced, like, the 70s, the Beatles, what all you need is love. But if the 70s can be characterized by anything, it's kind of this abandonment of God and the embrace of the internal spirituality.
Yep.
They're promoting love in those movements, but if there is no ultimate good, then there's nothing to ultimately desire for people. There's nothing really there to will.
Yep.
So they're just saying the word love, but what are they desiring for people in those moments, right? What are they willing for them? What good are they trying to direct them towards? Okay.
Yep.
Absolute freedom. Well, that didn't go so well, doing whatever one wants. Like, no, yeah. So you can see with that example how complicated this can get.
And I think this is the point that we've made before, perhaps on the podcast, but understanding as we go down this hierarchy a little bit, of understanding that to your point about it, how easily it can get distorted too, that even a human being is not the ultimate good. They are a good, but they're not the ultimate good. And so even within the context of good, properly oriented love among humans, our goal should not be the good of that person for the person as an end, period. It should be the good of that person for the end of that person reaching that goal themselves of having relation with God and being in heaven ultimately. Okay. And like, that's, I think, part of the importance too, because to your point about the 70s thing, it can be easy to think, oh, but isn't it a good if I love that person so that they can experience what they perceive as their good in their own context? And that's where we have to be careful to not fall into like the relativistic understanding, but understand that this is why we have to do this in the context of an objective good, that there is an objective good outside of us that is not simply what you or I happen to think is good for us, quote unquote, but an actual objective good.
Yeah, because then at that moment, love almost seems to become impossible without the objective good. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was good. So next, we are, I guess, going to say, what does that definition of love, living it out, what does that look like in society, right? Yeah. And maybe, and so do we want to start? Like, I think you kind of already did start, like, love of God.
I think that's where I was going with this, was to use the scriptural example to understand that first, it has to be lived out through love of God. Right. And so that's where, in our individual circumstances, that means developing a relationship with God. That means praying on a regular basis, ideally every day. That means, for a Christian or a Catholic, it means going to your church services every Sunday. It means following the precepts of that church. And that's where, obviously, if we, got into the details of the Catholic understanding of that, that would mean very specific things too, actually, with some of the precepts that are meant to be followed. But even fundamentally, on a 10 Commandment sense that could be understood by any Christian, what does it mean to love God? Keep holy the Sabbath day, for one thing. That's one of the commandments that the Lord himself gave to Moses. Don't blaspheme the name of God. What's the third? There's three God ones. You shall have no other gods.
Yeah, no false gods.
So, keep holy the Lord's day. Don't blaspheme God or his name, and make sure that you're careful not to have false gods. And even I think those other two can be relatively straightforward in a certain sense of, keep holy the Sabbath. You could get into all sorts of things, but I think the not having false gods is, some of our like Protestant brothers and sisters, I think almost do better at understanding this one than us sometimes nowadays as Catholics. But it's so easy in our world today for something else to become a false god that we don't even realize. And I think that's where it's really important to always be checking that in that hierarchy of love of, am I loving this person, this thing, this experience for the sake of relationship with God, or am I loving with it because it makes me feel good, or it makes me have like happy feelings or whatever? And to be clear, those things aren't always separate, because obviously things that we do out of love for God can also make us feel good and make us happy, but they also can be separated. So
yeah, no, I like how you pointed out the idolatry. People think like, oh, that doesn't apply to us anymore because we don't worship idols. It's like, but no, like if there is something that is more important to you than God, then that is in a sense your idol. And there are obvious things that even people will admit, like, yeah, I shouldn't look at my phone as much as I do. I'm not saying people are necessarily committing idolatry if they look at their phone, but if you have an addiction to it, then I would have to ask yourself, how did you get in that situation? And then there are other situations where people may be less aware of, and I guess I've found myself in that situation where, as a father, as a husband, where I put my wife and my kids first before God.
yeah,
And they're like, no. And I think to myself, no, I'm supposed to love my wife and love my kids. And so therefore I give my all to them. And it's like, well, no, you give your all to God. And by giving your all to God, you will in turn give yourself to your wife and your kids. And you see this happen with like the helicopter parents. They smother their kids with love, but they make their kids the most important thing in their life. And
exactly.
and when you do that,
example.
and the really upsetting thing about that is, you might think to yourself, okay, maybe I love my kids more than I love God, and that's not great, but at least I'm loving my kids. It's like, well, actually, you're harming your kids when you do that.
Yeah.
And every kid who's had a helicopter parent, which I didn't, fortunately, but everyone who's had a helicopter parent will say, yeah, no, I have a negative relationship with my mom and dad, unfortunately. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think those examples you just gave is a perfect segue to get into a little more detail. So, we've kind of established like, okay, love of God is first.
Yes.
And this is where we get into this understanding of the order of love. And I think one of the helpful ways to understand this we'll go into the more kind of backing of it in a second here, but I think one of the really helpful ways right up front that I always think about it from in a really practical sense is about time. Is that we are finite beings who live within the confines of time, which is finite. And so that means that, we have 24 hours in a day. And out of those 24 hours in a day, that can be a really helpful way to examine our conscience about how did I order the hierarchy of love today? Because I thought of it when you pointed out the example of the phone, which I was also thinking of, in a 24-hour day, if we spent 2 hours scrolling on our phone and we prayed not at all or 10 minutes or something that day, that's very disproportionate. Doesn't necessarily mean that we should be praying the exact amount of time that we're on our phone. I'm not necessarily saying that, but the point is that there's a clear sense there of like, how much time are you giving to each person, each situation, each thing in your day? And that can be one of the ways, which we'll get into a little bit later, maybe into like how to distinguish this. But yeah,
2 hours, Peter. That's rookie numbers. 2 hours a day on the phone. I'm joking.
I mean, honestly,
student-wise,
young people nowadays, that probably is really low. I don't think I'm even close to 2 hours, but I also try not to, and Exodus has helped me with that, and I work a job and all that. But
but
yeah,
my students have full-time jobs on their phones. Like I look at their screen time, and I'm like, 6 hours a day.
I mean, granted, I'd probably be shocked at how much screen time if I looked at it, but
no, yeah, especially when you have like a weekend where nothing's going on. But it's so funny to hear my students be like, "Oh, these teachers, they give us so much homework. I have no time to do this or no time to do that." I'm like,
Yeah,
"All right,
and
well,
you're like,
see,
well, how many hours did you spend on your phone?
yeah, well, you got 6 hours, buddy. Like, so
Yeah,
it's fine.
no, that's a great point. That's exactly right.
But
So here's where so we've got love of God
Yes.
generally established, and that's at the top. Jesus then says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Those are the two greatest commandments. Okay, great. So actually, first of all, in that, we should probably think a little bit about love of self. That, again, if we're orienting this in the context of love of God and of relationship with God, that means that we should be making sure that in our own lives, we're taking care of ourselves. And I think that's actually important to be said, because I think that can be lost a lot of the time, particularly even among people who like really radically want to serve others, whether it be serving the poor or doing ministry of some sort or whatever, where, they want to give of their whole self, and they give so much that they don't actually maintain proper love of themselves, not in a selfish way, not in an unhealthy way, but in a sense of understanding that we as humans need to be nourished in our own spiritual lives as well as our physical lives. So yeah, we need to eat to sustain ourselves, but we also need to spiritually eat to sustain ourselves. And so that means, like I said, every day taking some time to pray, taking some time to do things that might be helpful to you, whether that be, exercising a little bit or reading a good book or something that is like, as I think we've maybe even talked about before, like holy leisure per se. And what that means is not even necessarily always spiritual, to my point about exercise, but it's something that is like holistically good for us, because we are body and soul composites. We are not just like, a separate body and a separate soul. And we have to, we should be focusing on trying to nourish ourselves first so that we can then love others.
I think a really good example of this, shout out to my friend Zach in Denver. We were chatting last night, and he and I are very adamant, and you and I have discussed this too. For married people, let's just focus on men here because we're guys. It is really important that married men make time to hang out with other men.
Yes.
Even if they have very big families and they're very busy. Because you have to have that taking care, that treat yourself mentality, to love yourself, like you were saying. And some people might say, well, you're taking away time from your wife and kids when everything's already so busy and crazy. And it's like, if you don't take care of yourself, you're going to have very little to give to your wife and kids. Actually.
Exactly.
And the exact same thing goes for wives. And to be honest with you, wives are probably the ones who suffer the most in this realm. Men definitely like do suffer a lot in this. But like my wife, she's going back to Franciscan in a few weeks, in about a month, to go to a household reunion. And she was like, I'm not sure if I should go. I'm like, should I take our daughter? And I was like, dude, you go by yourself. Okay. Like, treat yourself. All right. Because I've gotten plenty of opportunities to do stuff like that. And I'm really happy she's getting that chance. But like you said, that love of self, that self-care, it's fundamental, not only for your happiness, but for you to be able to love others and fulfill that commandment to love thy neighbor.
Exactly. So, yeah. And I think it comes back to that, I think for most of my life, I always thought it was kind of trite, but it also is a little true. The classic phrase of like, you can't give what you don't have. That if you don't love yourself, and that's, our Lord says it right there, love your neighbor as yourself. You can't love your neighbor properly if you're not loving yourself properly. And again, that comes down to fundamentally willing the good of the other, but in this case, willing your own good. And so that's why it's so important that you want yourself to attain heaven, that you want yourself to have a good, healthy relationship with God, and then that you want yourself to be in a good position to be able to love others.
Yes.
So we have love of God, then we have love of self in the proper sense, not selfish, but but understanding how to love yourself properly, and then love of neighbor. And that's the one that I think brings up the most questions and the most confusion and the most, because when you think about it in a really black and white sense, it's like, oh, well, Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, right? So we should just love everybody the same way that we love ourselves. And that's a great thought. But the problem is that life is way more complex than that, because a perfect example of that is you as a husband and father. You have a duty and an obligation, and we'll get into the reasons why in a second, but you have a duty and an obligation as a husband and father to love God, then yourself, then your spouse, then your kids, then the community, then then like the state, then the nation. And so that's where it's important to understand that, like, in that hierarchy, there are three things that Jesus states very clearly. Two of them are really easy, in a certain sense, are really easy to understand, very clear, like love of God, love of self. The third one is a very broad category because neighbor means a lot of different things. It means the other. It means all those around us. But then the church, over the last 2,000 years, has helped us to understand what it means to love neighbor and also how we go about that. And that's where we'll get into some details in this, hopefully, of like private property, the universal destination of goods, which will explain both of those, and kind of why this order of love is so important to understand those things, because as we love others, we have to come down that line. And you notice it's the classic thing that I always do is to go from the top down. You start with love of God, then love of self, then love of others.
Yeah, I mean, some people might be like, yeah, that makes sense. And maybe a few are like, I don't know, like it's a little confusing. But just look at it this way. Like, you don't have kids yet, Peter. You probably will. I'm not going to love your kids like I love my own. Like,
Exactly.
that'd be weird, actually, if I loved your kids like I love my own. Doesn't mean I don't love your kids. I won't love your kids. But yeah, there's this clear order to things. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think the order has been established, but as you stated, that general love of neighbor, it can get confusing quickly. So where do we want to start? What do you think?
I mean, I think it's important to just kind of sort of, I think it would be helpful to at least go down the list a little bit, and we can diverge from there maybe, but just to go down that hierarchy on a certain level, that we can give some general concepts of that. Obviously, that's a little different for everyone in the sense of someone who's married versus someone who's single, whatever. But you also can get into, on a really basic level, love of God, love of self. Then the church would say love of family next. And that's where family could be distinguished a little bit differently. So if you're, a young person who's not an adult yet, your family is obviously the family that you're living with, that you're growing up in. If you're an adult who's married, then you would put your family, as in your wife and kids, or your husband and kids, first over your biological family that you grew up in. And that's an important distinction, I think, too, that is sometimes missed. Now, that doesn't, and I think, actually, yeah, well, let me finish this list and then I'll make a note on that, because that's a good point. So then you have family, then you have community. And that's where you start getting into a little more vagueness of like, what is your community, in the sense of the neighbors who live around you, the people who you go to church with, the people who you work with, those kind of things. And then you have the love of those in your state. In the U.S., obviously, we have 50 states. And so it's, you could use that to think about in the way of state. And then you have nation, and you have the love of the nation. What was I going to point out about that?
I think it had something to do with love of your wife and kids, but loving your mom and dad. Like that's both are your family, but as the scriptures say,
oh yes, I was just going to make the important point, and I think we should reiterate this multiple times throughout this conversation. None of these types of love, if actually loved properly, will take away from the others. And I think that's a really important thing to be said and resaid a few times, because I think that was why I thought of it, was in the context of the situation where we're talking about the distinction, let's say, between, I'm about to get married in a few months. I will love Shannon in a more and deeper way, in a certain sense. She will be a priority to me more than my family that I grew up in. But just because she's my priority doesn't mean that I love my family less, per se. That's why I think the time thing is so helpful to understand this, is that I'm going to dedicate more of my time and my energy toward willing the good of Shannon. But it doesn't change the fact that I still desire the good for my family. And I'm still going to pray for them, and I'm still going to see them when I can and spend time with them when I can. And so I think that's one of the things that's so important, is that people think of love in all these human ways that have to do simply with, how many times do I get to see that person this week? And granted, that is a little bit of the time thing that I was saying, but I think that people view it in this way where if I don't see you as often, you don't love me as much.
Yeah. And you always have to keep going back to the definition of what is the good for the person. So shout out to my parents, particularly my mom, just because I know we've discussed this, but as I got older, she would have to let me go.
Mm-hmm.
And she would always say, this is what God wants me to do. It hurts, but what is best for myself and what is best for you? Well, first of all, what is best for, my mom would say, myself as a mother, is to let my son fulfill his vocation. That requires him to leave me. And that's me desiring heaven for my son by letting him leave. And I reciprocate that by desiring my mom to desire that.
Yeah.
So
that's beautiful.
You could even make an argument that you love your parents more by leaving them. Oh no, that is just the argument. You are loving your parents more by leaving them and marrying someone else, because you should desire.
Because you're fulfilling what your purpose is. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So and my mom I moved away from my parents. I live 3,000 miles away from them, and it's very difficult. But my parents have just been extremely gracious, because they have responded to God's grace, and they've understood this order of love, and that it isn't Reese moved away and he loves us less. That thought didn't cross their mind once, because they're just like, no. When a husband grows up, he leaves his mother and father. He's joined to his wife. Yeah.
Exactly.
So and like I said, it's not like you said, it's not a loving less going on by any means. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So love of God, love of self, spouse, kids, and also like parents, family, and then how that develops throughout time as your vocation becomes manifest. What's next? Do we want to unpack a little bit of the relationship of loving your spouse then your kids? Do we need to talk more
sure.
about that? Yeah.
I mean, you can start on that since you're actually married, so I can only speak theoretically.
Also, just as a teacher, and I've been teaching for 7 years and seeing high school kids.
Shout out to your students.
Shout out to my students. It is a huge positive impact on kids for them to see their parents love each other. Like sorry if I'm going to get a little explicit right here, but I like my kids to see my wife and I kiss, and they're like, ew, and like it's really funny because like our kids, when they were like 2, they would get upset. They would get like jealous.
You're like stealing time. Yeah. They're
exactly.
Like, I want mommy to myself, or I want daddy to myself.
Yeah. Especially like my daughter, like, but it's actually just very healthy. Like for the sake of your kids, you need to love your spouse.
Yeah.
And I remember my mom said this. This was before I was married. Shout out to my mom again. I remember I have a younger sister. And my brother and I would tease her. My brother and I would tease her a good amount. And my mom was like, Reese, if you treat her that way, you're going to set a very low standard for the men that she desires. And that principle is applied to fathers and mothers. Mm-hmm. The way I treat my wife is the way my sons are going to say, okay, that's how I need to treat if I get married, my spouse. And that's how my daughter's going to view, okay, that's how I should be treated.
Yeah.
So you better do it well, and when you don't, you better apologize, and your kids better know about it. So for the sake of your kids, you need to love your spouse above them.
Yep.
Yeah. Otherwise, you see it happen all the time, and it's never perfect. Like, my goodness, especially first-time parents, and I'm sure you'll experience this.
Yeah.
I mean, a kid is born in, it radically changes your life, and especially for the mother, if she's breastfeeding. Like, if we're adding up time, like, she's just going to be spending more. She's just going to be spending more time with the baby. And actually, this is maybe even going back to relationship with God, like loving God and love of self. Like, there's all these. Everyone's really into doctors nowadays, and like the science behind sleep and all these things. And like people cannot function on a long period of time with less than 7 hours of sleep. For a long period of time, they cannot function at a high level. And I'm just sitting there thinking, I'm like, so it's just like, just forget the moms who just gave birth to babies.
Yeah, this is what I'm not sure if I even believe that statistic, but yeah.
I know I'm appealing to ethos here, but the studies are pretty clear. Like if you are not getting sleep,
I
and your body
believe
is
that,
not,
but I think I would debate that statistic on what they're considering to be functioning properly. But
right.
that's fair enough. But
But
yeah, exactly. To your point, like mothers who are
just-
breastfeeding are obviously not getting a lot of sleep for a prolonged period of time.
oh my gosh, yeah, that's an entirely different topic that I could go off on that I'm really passionate about. But the mother in particular, like she's supposed to be waking up every 2 hours to feed her child for the first 6 weeks at the very least. That's a month and a half of a very difficult sleep cycle. And so, yeah, we have these seasons where things appear out of whack if we kept track of the time in the spreadsheet and be like, well, looks like you love your baby a lot more than you love God right now. It's like, well, no, like that's not really
and
what's
I
going
think
on
this
here.
is, I will say that's a great point to bring up as far as the loving neighbor thing though too, is to understand that all of us have, as creatures of God, and especially the baptized who are beloved sons or daughters of God, we all have God in us in a certain way. And so when we love others, we do love God in a certain sense.
Yes.
And I think that's a great distinction that's so important to be drawn for example, that one is so, Cameron Frad talks about this, and I've heard others mention it too, other women, of the importance of a mother understanding, for example, that if she, has not been able to pray much in the first few weeks after the baby's born, and she's like, man, my relationship with God is just so horrible right now, to understand that you making the sacrifice to get up and like do that every couple hours for your child, and that's why it's so important to understand sacrifice with love too, that sacrifice is a form of love of God, because you're a loving God in your child. Mm-hmm. You're loving the person of God right in front of you in that moment. As Mother Teresa always talks about, of seeing the face of God in every person you encounter, that child who is yours can be the face of God. So
it's really good you said that, because I know a lot of women, like my wife included, struggle with the lack of time for prayer because they feel guilty whenever they get the free time. They want to sleep, and they should,
Yeah.
And they feel guilty about that, like, oh, I should be praying. But no, I remember Matt Frad saying, or I think he was sharing a quote from his wife, Cameron, that the holy hour of the new mother or the mother of a newborn is waving at your icons as you pass by them. Or like that's what your prayer is, because that's what you have time for, and you ought not to feel guilty for that, because as you said, you are in a sense loving God when you're making this sacrifice.
Yeah,
so yeah, encourage,
exactly.
shout out to the moms out there, and don't feel bad for your lack of time, especially at that stage in life. So love of your spouse for the sake of your kids. And then there are times, obviously, where that gets a little uncomfortable, that gets out of whack, where you will be spending more time with your kids just because of the nature of their age and their
Absolutely.
needs. And especially those people who have kids with medical needs on top of that. I have a friend who his daughter is sick, born with a pretty significant hole in her heart. Not one that closed up easily, and she's gonna have a heart transplant, and she was on oxygen for the first 2 years of her life, and just and going through therapy and all this stuff nonstop. Like that's gonna be difficult, and it's gonna take time away from the love of spouse. So want to make sure that those people don't feel guilty either, and that is a love of spouse as well. Like you said, it is a love of God to be that mother of a newborn, okay, and that father of a newborn, and it's also love of spouse when you're taking care of those kids with disabilities.
And I think the family situation becomes a very tricky situation in the sense, it's very simple in one sense, but it becomes tricky in the understanding that it's important to realize that there's a lot of room for different things within that, to your point about all these different scenarios, that it's not just a straightforward, we think that's important to emphasize nowadays, because I think there have been a lot of families in our, maybe not in our lifetime, but in recent generations, that have fallen into this sort of trap of the parents focus everything on the kids and they neglect having any relationship with each other. Mm-hmm. And that ends up being a recipe for disaster. But at the same time, while there should be a significant importance of understanding that primarily I think this is the thing is, again, it's about the hierarchy and the primacy, and it doesn't mean those other things can't take place at times. So like the primary way is for the spouses to love each other first and then the children. Are there seasons and times when that's not going to happen in that way and that's okay? Yes, absolutely. And I think that's the like way to understand it is it's about what is the first principle, what is the primacy, and then how does it actually sometimes take place, and is that okay? And yes, the answer is yes, it's okay.
Yeah, and I've always heard statistically, practically, it's the families that sit around and have dinner at least a few times a week. Those are the families who are doing well with each other. And, you know, dinners, you're sitting around the table for a half hour, you know, and it's not a lot of time in the grand scheme of things, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, shout out to my parents. Like that's something that I grew up with that I didn't realize until I was, I think, an adult, just how many people in my age range didn't grow up with that.
Yeah.
I just assumed that was a normal thing that everyone did. But those family dinners were amazing. Like I very much felt a significant closeness with my family through that and through, you know, just growing up with it. And my dad would always make an effort to, you know, he would, even when he worked late and stuff like that, he would usually, that only happened pretty rarely. Like in general, he would make sure that he was home for family dinners, and we would work our schedule such that even when we were doing things like karate or other things, we would do them after dinner. Like we would still have the family dinner and sit down, and then we'd go do our things if we needed to. But we worked out schedules such that we could make that work where we still took that intentional time as a family.
Yeah, no, it makes a big difference. So next.
Yeah, so you were kind of giving us the example of the family. So obviously, you know, God, self,
right,
neighbor, which it becomes family, whether you're talking about your spouse and kids or in the case of others. Although also I think you can relate this real quick to religious too, that really ultimately to your point, actually, yeah, this is important to me, to your point about like your mom saying that it was good for you to fulfill your vocation, to understand that we are all called to one of two primary vocations, which is either to be a husband or wife, or to be a religious of some sort, whether that means a priest or a brother or a sister or any of those things. And within that, there is a family that we are designated, just as the Lord, just as Genesis says, and then the Lord quotes in the Gospels of that, you know, a father leaves, or a son leaves his mother and father and clings to his wife. In the same way, though, we are all called to proceed from our family of origin that we grew up in to a new family and take that on. And so whether you're talking about, and again, that doesn't mean that you completely discard your family of origin, to your great example of you with your parents and everything. You still love them. You still see them. They even just came to visit recently. But you also have this new family. In your case, it's a spouse and kids. But in the case of, you know, our priest friends, for example, their family becomes their other priests. It becomes their parish. It becomes the other like things in that regard. Or for a religious, it's even easier to see because it becomes the other people in your monastery or convent. Those people, those brothers or those sisters become your family that you are now a part of. And that's your primary focus after God and self, and then family.
It's good you brought that up because Father Stephen Roth gave a talk to Fishes of Men a couple months ago just on vocations, and it was obviously to the fathers, to the men of the group, and how to raise sons who might be open to the priesthood, to that vocation. And he shared a disturbing fact that a big hiccup that he experiences with his seminarians is how unsupportive their families are throughout seminary. And what was even more disturbing was that seminarians who had families that were not necessarily religious, and the seminarian was like the only religious individual, those families were more supportive than Catholic families, Father Roth said.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, what? And he's like, yeah. He's like, I don't get it either. You would think that the Catholic families would rejoice to have a son who's a priest, but they tend to be the ones who are the most upset when their son goes home and says, I've applied to seminary and I've just been accepted or whatever. So, yeah, that order of love love of God. This is not your son or your daughter. I mean, it's really difficult for those who join orders, especially the sisters, where I know there's some orders where you see your parents once a year, and that's it. One day a year. But it's not this, my son is my daughter, my son is dying to me. No, you can't think like that. And, as a father, sure, it's still difficult. It would be difficult I would rejoice that my daughter had discerned a vocation like that. But of course there would be, fear involved. But love isn't supposed to be easy. Jesus says that himself. If you love when it's easy, your love's not that impressive.
Yep.
I mean, and Jesus testifies to that by dying on the cross. That he's like, see, this wasn't so easy, but it was the right thing to do. So, yeah.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
No, that's a great point to emphasize, I think. And that's why we have to keep coming back to that understanding of love being willing the good of the other. Because to your point, often what's actually happening in those scenarios, not to call any specific parents out, but what's ultimately happening fundamentally is that the parent is not actually loving the child for their own good, because if a child's pursuing religious life, that's probably for their good, especially because even if they're not called to that, they can discern that and figure that out through that journey, and it will still be good for them and formative.
Yeah.
And that's where it's more important to be, there's this phrase that we used to use in Focus sometimes, holy indifference, to almost have like this holy indifference of saying, it's the Lord's will. Like, do what the Lord wills for you, even if that might not be what I wanted you to do. Like, I understand the thing of parents wanting to have, grandkids and a kid who does this and a kid who does that and whatever. That's wonderful. But if that's not the Lord's will for that person, then you shouldn't will that either.
Yeah.
That's not fundamentally love. That's actually more of like a selfish desire on your part than it is a selfless understanding of love and sacrifice.
Which can definitely be tough to hear, I'm sure, for some people, but it's like I said, love is not supposed to be easy in that sense. Yeah, it's supposed to be very challenging. So,
so we've had God, self, family,
which we've done a pretty good job of unpacking.
Yeah, and then I think the next ones, and this is where we can kind of, I think it's hard to give a lot of examples for these because there's so exactly. That's my point, is that the next one is basically community, state, and nation, which I think you could sort of say there should be a hierarchy of community first, then like local community first, then state, then nation. But even with that, like there's a lot of different things you could get into with that. And I think maybe this is where we could kind of say a few things about that if you want, and then I think we might want to just pivot at that point into talking about private property and universal destination of goods and all that. But
so talking about community, like local, state, nation. Like,
yeah.
Well, I guess, yeah, like what the community one gets confusing, and you kind of alluded to it already. It's like, what do you mean by the community?
Correct.
Do you mean the people, everyone in your apartment complex? Do you mean your parish? What do we mean by that? What do you think?
Well, and I think the example I would give is that we live in a world that has lost the sense of what that should be. So I think that the fundamental understanding of what community should be, in the sense of how we love our community, would be those in the local community that we live in, as in all those around us physically.
Because, yeah, I mean, I guess in past times, the parish, the church, the community were all the same thing.
Correct.
Right,
Exactly. That's where I'm going with this, is that when you think about historically, people lived in, most of the time, they lived in smaller communities, whether it be a small town or a neighborhood or whatever, and the parish church was the church for that community.
Right.
And the grocery store was the small corner store for that community. And that was more how these things were understood. And so it's much easier to understand how you love community in that context. And I think that's part of why we end up with such a tricky scenario nowadays of even the hierarchy of community, state, and nation, because everything is so globalized and everything is everyone drives everywhere, everyone goes to everything, all the places, to your point, like I live in an apartment complex right now. I don't really know anyone else who lives in this apartment complex. that is what it is. Like, we could say all sorts of things about that, but the reality is that it's true. I do go to the local parish, which is more than some people, but like, you know, there's still a lot of, but like half the people who go to the local parish don't actually live in this local community. Half of them live 15, 20, 30 minutes driving away, and they just happen to choose to go to that parish. And then there's, you know, the deeper thing of, you know, our schools that we participate in, or our works that we, you know, people will work 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour from where they live. Like, so I think that's where you get into this tricky scenario of where do you put the hierarchy once you get past family? Where does the hierarchy go of who you love first after family?
Yeah. What do you think it is? Do you think it's the parish? I mean, I think that's...
Honestly, I'm not sure. That's a good question. I think off the cuff here, I think I would say that it's some combination of the parish and of your community that you may have established potentially. So like an example of that to me would be like Fishers of Men in Harford County, that you have this kind of community sort of that's made up of people who don't all live in the same neighborhood. They don't all go to the same parishes, but it's a bunch of men in this community who have the same understanding. So I think that's one of the helpful things with the community thing is in the context of where we're talking about love of God and willing the good of the other, that like willing the good of the other is for love of God. That needs to be the fundamental backing, the fundamental like reason behind your most like the communities that come after family. Mm-hmm. So like eventually we're called to love everyone, even if they're, you know, the most atheistic person who hates religion or whatever. We're called to love everyone, to be clear. But where the hierarchy is there, I think that you can say that community in the sense of those who have the same belief system founded on Christ can be the next step down from family in that community sense.
Yeah. And this goes without saying, but I think it still needs to be stated. There are people who give themselves so much to the community that they're getting the hierarchy confused, right? Where, because to be honest, like the reason for my zeal in getting involved in my parish and getting involved with Fishers of Men is because of love of God, for love of self, because I know that I need it for my soul, for my wife to have people who build her up. Mm-hmm. And then for my kids, we talked about this when we gave our talk at Fishers of Men. I want my son to have a Jonathan to his David, and I want my daughters to have the same thing. But it's very easy, I think, where people starts to care more for the community than the individuals within it. Okay, or maybe the people that they care more for that's a different thing, where they care more for the community than the people in their family per se. Yeah, mm-hmm. And this isn't exactly a perfect actual example that I've experienced, but I do remember having a student in Denver. He felt called to the political life to be a politician, and he said that he didn't think he should get married because of the demanding nature of the political lifestyle. And I told him, occupation does not determine vocation, buddy.
Correct.
Yeah. And while what he was saying was, he was clearly trying to think through things carefully, you know, and be gentle. But it's very quick where people become so self-giving to their community. Like I'll poke on myself right here rather than a former student. It's very easy for people in my line of work who teach theology and do campus ministry to think, oh, I'm doing the Lord's work. You know, I need to give a lot of time at this location. But it happens where those people do that and then they don't have good home lives. It's because they're getting the hierarchy out of whack.
And I think that's something that you would probably be willing to admit that you even have had to make sure that you're careful to.
Oh, for sure.
Like check yourself on regularly of, am I overcommitting myself to doing, you know, both teaching and campus ministry and this extracurricular thing? Am I making sure that I'm still spending enough time with my family? And I can get that because I'm sure I would be in the same boat once I have a family of like having to be careful not to spend too much time doing ministry things or doing whatever. Like, yeah.
It was actually funny you mentioned that. So I didn't tell you this. Remember last year I did the sports athletics job?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not doing it this year. Did I tell you that already?
You did, yeah.
Oh, I did over text. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, or no, I think we
You
talked
told
about
me
it
at
Rob's party.
yeah,
Yeah. I was a little fiery then
community
because I
lunch.
think I just decided not to do it.
Yeah, you had.
But
that's great. I commend you in that. Like, I think that's a great discernment that you had there.
yeah, and it made sense for the first 2 years, I think. It worked well. But yeah, so just so people don't, if people are not following along, I started out as a teacher. And then after my first year, I was asked to join the campus ministry team on top of teaching. I lost like one class, but I was still teaching a pretty full load. But I also was working for the athletic department during the spring. So I was kind of pulling 12-hour days, 3 to 4 days a week for about 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I did that was for money. And this is where it gets like, distorted, where it's like, oh, I'm making money to support my family, and
Yeah.
is that me not loving my family right there? But we're at the point, like when I started this job, we had 2 kids. And
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
your
we were
family
not
has changed now.
we were not homeschooling either, and now we're homeschooling and we have 3 kids, and things are a bit more demanding. So, and my wife and I have also kind of adjusted like things we like to do with our free time. Like we've really prioritized like exercise for each other. And if I took the spring job this year, my wife would have lost all the momentum that she had built. And she would be even more exhausted because she's teaching the kids all day and working on the side. And I'm leaving her for 12 hours a day, 3 times a week. And I'm just like, man, but we really want that new bathroom,
Yeah.
And then I remember calling my dad one night, just like super anxious. I'm like, Dad, I don't know what to do. Like, am I being, because I did not want to work this job just because of how much time I would be away from my family. And I'm like, oh, but am I being selfish? And I call my dad, and my dad's like, no, you are not being selfish. So my dad was very helpful for me in that moment. But yeah, it's just, you can see just how easy it is to get everything confused and to get caught up in the community that you work for. I mean, people's community is like their work environment in some cases, right?
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
I mean, I would say that's probably the most common distortion of
Is the
the
work
order
one?
of love that probably every human or most humans in the United States experience. Would you agree?
So. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably given your line of work because it's tax season. It's I'm sure you struggle with that. I mean, not so much.
Yeah, and
right
I think
now,
I don't personally struggle with it in the sense that I have no desire to make that my thing, and so I'm actually constantly fighting against it and having to try to figure out how I can like work enough hours to still get the work done that I need to get done and not neglect all my like personal and family obligations and stuff. But it is interesting because I see that with many of the people who work in my field, let's say, who, I see the hours they work and I'm like, do you do other things? Like what? Like, and I don't mean that in a mean way or a judgmental way. I can't imagine that personally. But I think that's the thing, is that a lot of people in our world, especially in our modern US culture, tend to just their thing that they spend the majority of their time on is work. Yeah. And that's what's most important.
Well, that's how we gauge success nowadays, and it's very upsetting.
And it's the money thing too. To your point, it's both the success in the prestige sense and the success in the money sense too.
Yeah, and it's so complicated too because the parents like are pushing it as well. The parents are like, I mean, this is the stories we talk about. I mean, I'm a father, and my kids are very young. They have achieved very little so far.
Yeah.
But like, get this. So Ronan, the past week, he said this twice. He's like, I can't wait to die and become a saint.
Wow.
And I'm like,
that's awesome.
Chill out there, buddy. Like, but like, kind of like, oh, that's good. You want to become a saint, buddy? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you don't want to die anytime soon, but yeah, that's.
But
awesome,
it's kind of like the saint. I'm not comparing my son to Saint Teresa of Lisieux, but it's kind of like in the story of the soul, where she's like, Mom, because like there's this.
Oh yeah, well, she tells her mom that she wants her to die.
Yeah, she's like, Mom, I can't wait for you to die so you can be with Jesus. You're like, what? Like, that's crazy. But like in this really childlike, pure sense, it's like, oh no, that makes sense. But we like to brag about our kids, and the things that catch people's attention are if I told that story, like I'm telling that story to you, and you and I are the same worldview, so you like get that. But if I'm at a cocktail party, I'm like, get what my 6-year-old said, and they would be like, "That's freaking weird, dude. Why
Yeah,
would
exactly.
you say that?" And they're like, "Shouldn't like does he play any sports?
Yeah,
Like what are
exactly,
his grades
exactly.
like and stuff?" I'm like, dude, I care more about his virtue. I care more about his soul. We talked about this earlier, like than anything. Okay, and
Yep, because our world tends to judge things based on status, to your point. Like,
Yeah.
what is your, what, think about like the most common question that we ask people. And I know I fall into this too, just because it's the easy default. But when you meet someone at like a party or something, what is the first question that most people ask after their name?
what do you do?
What do you do for work?
Yeah.
Or what do you do?
Yeah, and it means what do you do for work? Yeah,
Yeah.
It's and there is. I don't want to completely crap on that question because I used to think like
No,
I hate
I'm
that.
not saying we can't ask that question, but
Right.
it's clearly showing something about the way that we perceive the world.
We base your identity off your occupation, which is just not. It's not accurate. I mean, it's sure maybe a portion, but like, yeah, it's a distortion of the hierarchy of what we should love and what we should care about the person. And so, yeah, that's our relationship with work is very unhealthy. And then just to make it more complicated, now we live in a world where both spouses and married couples and families are expected to work on top of that, and that just throws a wrench.
Which is a whole nother thing
Oh
that,
my
I could
gosh.
go on a whole tangent about the whole 2 income trap and the problem of our world with that, but we'll leave that for another time.
Yeah,
But
it's tough, man. It's tough. But okay, so so the community. There's still so much more to talk about with the community, but you said I think a good way to view it, as long as you make sure that the community, that your love of community is where it's supposed to be in the hierarchy, and you're primarily focusing on loving God, then you're probably loving the right community in the right way. Is that something what you said, or
I mean, I think I was more just saying that as long as the hierarchy is correct in the sense of loving God, self, family, and then community, there's a lot of room there for what is your community?
Mhm.
How are you loving that? What potentially different communities might you have? Because again, in our world today, I think that's the thing, is I gave the general sense that I would say is like what a community should be. But then the reality of our world today means that oftentimes the community is not as simple as everyone all living in the same place and you all go to the same grocery store and the same church and the same whatever. And so in a certain sense, I think a lot of people nowadays often have multiple communities.
Yeah.
And so then I think that's where you can make some general comments on, like, I would say that I think I would agree with you on this, that I think in the hierarchy of love, the church community, for example, should come ahead of your work community, let's say.
Oh yeah.
But there is a lot of gray area in some of those things when you start getting to like the further down that list you go of, work community, state, nation, all these things, like you get a little more into the gray area of like how to view that. Although I think that something I come back to oftentimes is Stephen Covey in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, talks about the circle of concern versus the circle of influence. And I think that a helpful thing with understanding, again, the hierarchy of love is focusing on your circle of influence more than your circle of concern. And so your circle of concern is more the broad things that you might know about and might concern you on some level, like policies that are happening in your nation, let's say. But how much do those policies that are happening in your nation impact you on a day-to-day basis? Some of them do, absolutely. Many of them don't necessarily. And so that's where those are things that are more in your circle of concern. Your circle of influence is more about, it's like a radiating circle, kind of like the hierarchy of love that we're talking about of, God, family, then like your church community could be a circle of influence, your work community could be a circle of influence. But the further away that you get from the direct influence of the people you interact with on a regular basis, the more that goes into the circle of concern. And you're like, okay, I don't need to give as much of my I'm going to say this and then clarify it. I don't need to give as much as my love to these things that are more in my circle of concern than I do to the things in my circle of influence. That does not mean that we don't love every person, but it means that we are not called to love by the Lord. We are not called to love, someone. I mean, a great example of it is that you and I are not called to love some particular individual in Texas that we don't know, the same way that we're called to love our next door neighbor, even. Like, even someone who we don't, let's say two people we don't know, but we're called to love our next door neighbor more than, in a more intentional sense, than we are to love some random person in Texas that we've never met. Doesn't mean that we don't love them all as beloved creatures and or beloved sons or daughters of God, but we're not called all to love them in the same particular way.
Like, what are you going to do about it? Like, what, like, so does the circle of influence and circle of concern go, like, how did this circle of influence does not, or the circle
They're
of concern,
concentric circles.
Right.
So they can cross over a little bit.
Right, yeah. But when you say circle of concern, you say these are things you're concerned about, but they don't really influence you. Does it also go the way where you can't really influence them?
Well, yeah, sorry.
Oh.
I should make that more clear. That's exactly what I mean, is that there are things that concern you, but you can't influence them.
Okay.
Exactly. So that's the point about, like, why I use the example of national things that, you know, aside from, for example, we just had a presidential election a few months back. That's something where, okay, fair enough. You can influence that on some level. But once that presidential election is over, you mostly can't do a whole lot about the policies that president is putting into place. Mm-hmm. Whether you like them or don't like them, there's not a whole lot that you can do about them either way. Yep. You can do something, potentially, when you're talking about politics, you can do something about some of your more local politics things. And I think that's one of the things that we get so backwards in our, just to go on a slight tangent real quick without saying anything specific about any political parties or anything, is just, I think our country falls into the trap, just like everywhere probably, but of people get really obsessed with national politics and completely neglect to focus on local politics at all. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to focus on politics at all, really we should be focusing, and this is true for me as well, I need to remember this myself, that we should be focusing on local politics first and foremost, because those are the things that we can actually potentially influence.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, I mean, that's the principle of subsidiarity.
Exactly.
Catholic social teaching, which is in perfect harmony with this hierarchy of love on top of that, and probably founded upon it, actually. So,
yeah.
So good. All right. So the community, that seems, I think we've covered the local community, really. All right. And I guess there's really not a whole, I mean, so is there a lot to say about the state?
No, I don't think so. I think state and nation are pretty straightforward, I think, in the sense that they're quite vague. Yeah. In one sense, it just means, but they come after those other things. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, no, they definitely do. And it's, yeah, it is a falling for the trap when we care more about, like, the national politics than we do the local, like you said. It's a disorder of the hierarchy, and we see the consequence that it has. I cannot tell you the name of the mayor of my town. I cannot tell you the name of our state senators. But they're the ones who have the biggest impact.
But we all know the name of the president, and even some, like, oftentimes our representatives in Congress or whatever, and it's
I know the name of foreign presidents, dude.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Maryland is
same here.
Has the highest one of the highest state income taxes, and that's clearly impacting me a lot. More than, like, this national stuff too. So yeah, all right.
I think one last thing that I think we should touch on before moving real quick, unless you want to wait and get into detail in it more, but is just the emphasis on. So when we talk about these hierarchy of love, I think this is where it's really important to be careful, because, like, so part of Catholic social teaching and part of the things that Jesus himself says in the scriptures is the importance of loving every person who has equal dignity as a person, loving them equally in the sense of, not in that sense of the hierarchy of love, but just in the sense of willing their good, because we should will the good of, because to my point about the difference between the random neighbor we don't know and the person in Texas, we can will the good of both of those people. It's just that we don't have any impact on the person in Texas, but we could potentially have an impact in a way that we could more intentionally will the good of the neighbor by having a conversation with them, by, interacting with them. So there's a difference there.
So the circle of concern, circle of influence.
Yeah, exactly. And I think something that's important to be said, though, is that it's really important to love and serve the poor, especially as Christians and as Catholics. But loving and serving the poor is not intended to come above, like, half at least of those other loves that we just described. So, like, when we're talking about the hierarchy of love of God, love of self, love of family, potentially even love of community. That's where like you get into, you should try to love the poor in your community in an intentional way before even loving the poor in a different community. And I think that's an important fundamental thing too. Is are we going out, if we're going to go serve the poor, are we going out and serving the poor in the local place where they serve the poor, the local soup kitchen or the local whatever, or do we drive to some other place that's, way outside our community to go serve the poor? Like, that's another important thing too. And again, it's the thing of the circle of concern versus circle of influence too, is that it's very easy in our world today for people to get really concerned about all the poor people in this place or that place, or the people who are struggling with this thing or that thing. But the thing is, are those people in your community? Are you going and serving the people in your community? Because here's why this is so important. If every person went and loved and served the poor and the people in their community who need that love and support, you wouldn't be concerned about the people in the other communities, because they would have people in their communities who were taking care of them. And I understand that doesn't happen in practice. Fair enough. But that doesn't then automatically mean that because it doesn't happen in practice, we should all be super concerned about all the people around the world. It means that we should focus on what we can do in our local community.
Yeah, and if people are really concerned about practice, well, then maybe they should consider the fact that it's actually just impossible for them to care for every poor person. Like
exactly.
It really upsets me that there are children, families starving in third world countries. It really upsets me that, genocide is taking place, and it's evil, and it should be called out. It should be condemned, and we should do that. That doesn't require a whole lot of effort, to be honest with you. But there is an impracticality to, like, the ability to take care of everyone. Unfortunately. And I don't know. There's more I want to say on that, but I think I need more time to think about it, because this is something that I struggle with, where let's just use like a weird example, not a weird example. Let's use a very explicit example. For some time, I haven't done a whole lot of research into this, but I know it's not widely talked about. China is performing some heavy persecution in the western part of its country against an Islamic group an ethnic group known as the Uyghurs, I think is their name. It's been going on for quite some time. And these people are just like being exterminated. It's genocide. And it's like, man, like what is our obligation there? Like, it's tragic what's taking place. Or maybe even North Korea, where people are being intentionally starved and put into camps. Like, what? I'm asking, I understand what you have just said, our circle of influence and our circle of concern. But I also I'm not so sure how comfortable I feel with the idea of, it's not our country, so there's not really anything we can do about it. Or I don't know.
No, I think that, okay, so there's a few things here. First of all, this is a great example of the problem of the media and the globalized world that we live in today, because in reality, you shouldn't even know about those things.
Right. But
the fact that we know about those things is a problem in and of itself. There's not a good reason why we know about those things. There is no good argument that anyone could make for it being an actual universal good that the media broadcast those sort of things around the world. Those are things that should be dealt with in those local places, and those problems should be addressed. Now, we live in a stupid, messed up global world that tries to push everything on everyone else because Satan wants that. It confuses the heck out of everyone. So that's where it's important to understand, again, this is where willing the good of the other. What is a way that I can will the good of another who I have no actual influence over? Prayer. That's it. Full stop. The only thing that you can do in that scenario is pray for those people. And that doesn't, and again, this is where the hierarchy thing comes in. Doesn't mean that your prayer then becomes consumed with every time I go to pray, I pray for the people who are being persecuted in China and the people who are being persecuted in North Korea and the people who are being persecuted in the Middle East and the people like you'll have a list for prayer every time that ends up focusing on just the persecutions, and that's ridiculous too. But you can offer some type of prayer for that on some sort of regular basis. You could have, a thing during your rosary or a thing during your quiet prayer time where I'm going to offer a couple prayers for, all those around the world who are destitute or all those who are being persecuted. I think that's part of the point too, is to understand that there's not really a practical distinction for you or I between someone being persecuted in China, North Korea, the Middle East, or anywhere else that's not like our circle of influence in a certain sense. And so that also becomes this weird like globalist thing of like, well, maybe it's worse for the people in this place over this place. Well, just pray for all those who are being persecuted, because that will cover all of it. The Lord knows, and he will try to help them. But it's not our duty to do that unless, one, in a particular scenario, this is where the distinction can come in again of like personal calls and personal people, that if someone really feels strongly called to go sacrifice themselves and serve that community and try to help those people, whatever thing we're talking about, fair enough. That could be a call that the Lord has for them. I'm not saying the Lord can't necessarily call people to move out of their community and go be a missionary somewhere else. But also, I think this is the other fundamental importance of understanding the hierarchy of love, that willing the good of the other means that they have a relationship with God. It doesn't even necessarily mean that their human life is preserved. Now, I know that's like controversial and a little strange to say, and I'm not saying that we should just like, let a bunch of horrible dictators or whatever kill people. Preserving life is an important and good thing. But it comes down to the hierarchy thing. What is most primary? What is most primary is that those people encounter the Lord. So a great example of that would be, a missionary who goes into that place and understands that I can't necessarily stop this horrible persecution from happening. And so these people might still be killed, and that's really tragic and awful, but I'm going to go try to evangelize them before that happens and help them to encounter the Lord so that they at least can have the hope and salvation of the gospel. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I get the practicality of it. Like it is impossible. Like we've said, it is impossible to be actively involved in every injustice that occurs across the globe. Yeah.
Maybe this will help a little bit too. I think this is one of the fundamental like sad problems of our world today, is that without the sense of a community, those things become more meaningless or more kind of removed from what they should be. Like when you know someone, even not necessarily like they don't need to be your best friend, but when you know someone who something tragic has happened to, you're naturally going to have more of a desire to help them, and you're going to have more sadness over that, at least you should actually, versus someone who you don't know at all, who's going through the exact same thing. And I think that the importance of thinking about the gospel message of like, it's actually probably good to think about, even though I'm making all these distinctions in love God and love your neighbor as yourself, it's important probably to think about the point that in our Lord's time, loving your neighbor didn't mean loving every single human being who existed on the planet in the same way. It meant more practically, go love your neighbor. Like, go be a good influence in the community that you live in. And that's, I think, the point, is that the devil wants to distract us. He wants us to waste. This is my point about the time thing sometimes, that the amount of time and mental energy that people nowadays often spend concerned with things happening in other countries or injustices happening around the world, or even sometimes injustices that are happening at a different part of this country, but that don't particularly pertain to that person, it's one thing to like hear about that thing and say a really quick prayer and be like, all right, it's in your hands, Lord. And I trust that you love those people more than I do. It's another thing for us to spend a lot of mental time and energy on that, to look into all the details of the thing that's happening to these people and how horrible it is, and to read about it and to talk about it and to think about it. Well, couldn't that time have been spent doing something better, doing something in your local community or with your family or with your friends or, like, and I don't mean with in the sense of necessarily like, oh, just go have fun and do pleasurable things, but maybe it means, spend that intentional time sacrificing or something. But I think that's an important distinction as well, is to understand that we have a tendency to put our time to these things that we probably shouldn't. And I'm as guilty of that as anyone at times. So I'm not trying to cast anything on anyone, but
yeah, to play devil's advocate, and I think there's a pretty easy response to this. Maybe not easy, but there is a response to this. So in my morality class, we discuss this tribe in Papua New Guinea who practices cannibalism, and they don't really consider themselves cannibals. They're unfamiliar with modern medicine, and they think that when someone dies unexpectedly, that they were killed by another tribe member who has been possessed by a evil spirit called a kahua. And so it's kind of silly. As the person's dying, they whisper into the ear of the witch doctor the name of the person who they think is the kahua that killed them. So let's say I'm dying, and I'm like, Peter, and then I die. Everyone's like, all right, it's Peter. He's the kahua. We need to eat Peter. So then they go and they kill Peter. They kill you and they eat you. And that's their justice system. So I discuss this with my students. I'm like,
okay.
Is there any, I try to weed out the moral relativist with this scenario.
Sure, yeah,
you know
that
what
makes
I mean?
sense.
And so I asked them, I'm like, okay, so is what they are doing wrong? And a lot of kids confuse my question with, are they evil people, for doing this, or
oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, you know what I mean? And they're like, no, they're not evil people.
Is what they're doing wrong, yes.
Yeah, but, right,
it's
yeah,
objectively wrong.
Right, exactly. But a lot of students will say, I don't care what they're doing in another country. Like, what effects does what they're doing have on me? I think there's a difference between that response and what you're saying, though. Would you agree?
Yes, but really only minutely in a certain sense, because again, we only know about that tribe because of the modern media that we have. But think about it from this standpoint. If you didn't have the media that we have now, you had no idea that tribe existed. Why would you spend any mental energy whatsoever thinking about that? Why should you care about that
I
at
get
all?
that. I get that point, but I'm asking what's the difference between what you're saying and the student's response? You said there is one. It's minute, but what is it?
I think it's merely that because of the world that we live in today, that was the point that I was making a second ago. I would say that because of the world that we live in today, I acknowledge that we live in the stupid world with the horrible amount of media and globalism that we live in, which I think is profoundly wrong, and I don't think God designed it that way. But that's the reality of the way that we've bastardized things in our world today. What that means is that we can hear about something like that and take a minute to say a prayer and then move on. Because, again, there's nothing practically that you or I are going to go do to solve the problem of that tribe doing that horrible thing.
Yeah, and that's the point I was hoping that you would make. That I think there is a temptation to take what you have said and then embrace even a spiritual apathy towards those things.
No, yeah, exactly, and that's not what I'm suggesting.
No,
whatsoever,
right, yeah, and that's what I said. Yeah,
You wanted to set that up for me. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, but that's what I'm seeing though with people who think like that is even a spiritual apathy towards those things.
Yeah, although I will. I mean, not to speak about any like students necessarily, but I will say that I think that
I'm not really
I
talking
think
about
even
students. I'm
no,
talking about
that's not
people.
my point. To use that example though, of somebody saying kind of like, "Oh well, I don't really care what happens in another country." I don't think that's automatically spiritual apathy though. I think it depends on the scenario because again, it comes down to we are finite beings with a finite amount of like even our emotional bandwidth, as people talk about it nowadays, is a finite thing. And like if somebody's had a really long day dealing with a lot of different like intense things in their life, do they really need to like go hear about some awful thing happening somewhere else? No. And so it's actually okay in a certain understanding of that to say, I don't care about what's happening in that place right now because it does not impact me whatsoever and it will actually just make me feel more anxious. And I would say, I think here's my point about the spiritual apathy thing is that I think that oftentimes that kind of thing can, like, knowing all those things about all the evils that are happening in the world can lead in an even graver sense than spiritual apathy to an exhaustion and a spiritual anxiety that leads to this sense of distrust because look at all the evil that's happening in the world. The world must be a horrible place, and how could God allow all this evil to happen? Versus just saying evil is going to happen because of sin, and that's not a good thing, and we should never say that's a good thing, and we should never be okay with it, but we don't need to know about all the evil that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting everyone, hey, go on the internet as soon as you get home and look up as many evil things as possible, then start praying for them. Like, yeah, there is, like you said, there's a limit to our bandwidth. But I think saying I don't care is a little too extreme.
Why? Can you explain why?
The definition of love. Now, what can you actually do? You can say a prayer. And like I said, I'm not saying, hey, go and just search up all these evil things and find out as many possible so you can pray for them. Because you said this yourself. You can make a general prayer for all those people who are suffering. But saying I don't care, it does.
What is why would the definition of love mean that I should care about a tribe committing cannibalism in Papua New Guinea that I have no way of changing? Other than just the sadness of like, oh, well,
that's caring.
Sucks that they do that.
That's caring right there.
Okay, but I would guarantee you almost that most people who say I don't care, because I have myself have actually said that about those sort of things before when people have told me about them sometimes. I promise you that most people who say that don't actually mean that they genuinely don't care. What they mean is I don't want to like think about that right now.
Okay, well then then you might want to not say that then is what I'm suggesting. Like if you want to be intentional with your words, then saying I don't care is like, first of all, it gives off, I would argue, something potentially scandalous even in your community.
Why?
Well,
I still am not convinced by this. Like I should care about this thing. By you saying that one should care about.
Well, no,
that.
but you just said saying I don't care. Like I don't really mean that. It's like, okay, all right, cool. Then it seems like we're in agreement. So then why say it? So then why say it?
If that's actually, I'm still not sure if we are though. That's what I'm saying. Like, can you explain more why one should care about that?
Well, no, but you just said you do care.
And and that's irrelevant right now. I'm still asking you to explain more why somebody should care, regardless of what I just answered. Why should someone care about that tribe in Papua New Guinea committing cannibalism if there's nothing they can do about it whatsoever?
Because I think you can pray for them. And that's what you can do. That's the exhaustion of your influence. And so a lot's not being asked of that person right there.
So I think what you're getting at, right, is that because we are called to love every person, which is profoundly true and important, which is what I was getting at in my answer of obviously why, fair enough, I should be more precise that I don't want to hear about that in that moment.
Which is true. I get that.
Is that I do care insofar that I see that as a tragedy because those people are human beings and they shouldn't be treated that way.
Yeah.
I think this is where my response to that comes from oftentimes, is that when I say I don't care, it doesn't mean I don't love those people. But what I mean is that there is nothing I can do to care. there is nothing I can do to care for them. It depends on your definition of the word care, I guess. But
Right.
like I can't do anything about that. So why should I care, quote unquote, about that? I should feel an emotion about that, and I do, because that's profoundly sad. But there's nothing that I can do about that. And so I don't need to think about that right now. And sure, I guess to your point, I could say, I don't want to hear about that right now, or I don't need to think about that right now. Fair enough. That would probably be a little bit more precise. But yeah.
Yeah, because during the pandemic, where it was just constant fear mongering, and let's just talk about bad stuff all the time. Like when the news is on, let's have a death toll always on the screen.
Yeah.
It's like I don't need to really be always reminded that someone's dying. Like you ever, Bono from U2, ever heard the band U2? He would do this thing at concerts where he would have the whole concert go dark, and then he would have his drummer hit his drum like every 30 seconds, and he would be like, every 30 seconds every 30 seconds that drum is going to be hit, and it means a child has died in Africa. And then a concert guy, someone in the crowd was like, well, then quit banging the freaking drum. It's like I don't need to really be reminded every second of this. Yeah, which when it comes
that's the point that I'm making.
Right.
Fair
Yeah,
enough.
and that is it is 100% valid point. I just
and I see your point that it's fair that we should have a concern, which is, again, that's where the circle of concern thing is helpful to understand, that we can have a concern for what is happening in that place, but there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, which
And so that's a fair point, that we should have a concern's a good word. I like that word.
Yeah.
That we should have concern for that, in the sense of, I feel compassion toward those people because they're human beings and they shouldn't be treated that way, but I can't do anything about it. So I keep wanting to say I don't care. I don't there's nothing that benefits me to think about other than saying a quick prayer or something.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, you shouldn't go and look up every evil thing and say a prayer for every evil thing.
But I think also another point that I've thought about in this whole discussion here is the importance of all of these things that we get so concerned about nowadays. Often, I would say often, and probably, and for most people almost always, take away trust from God. And I think that's part of my point too, is that fundamentally, that's one of the greatest struggles of every person, is foundationally we have a distrust of God. It's literally from the garden, Adam and Eve distrusting God in the garden. And every one of these, this is part of why I get so frustrated about the globalism of the world and all that, is not that I'm trying to say that we need to be quote unquote isolationists or something, but part of my point is that the more that the devil can get us to be focused on all these things that are happening in all these other places that we can't actually influence, what does that do? That makes us distrust more, because we go, well, this awful thing is happening. How could God let this happen? How could this happen? How could whatever? And again, not that those things aren't gravely wrong and evil. They are. But what are we, how do we focus on trying to build up our own trust? That's
And not only that, but the next logical step in that is to declare ourselves God and the ones who are in charge of saving the world.
Exactly.
And
you're exactly right. Yeah.
Right. And
that's a part of trust, because it's, we don't trust God to fix to take care of those people, and so we need to do something to fix it.
Right.
It's actually really funny, because I happened to see today, I don't even use Facebook, but the memory thing pops up sometimes, and I just clicked on it to see, and it was a memory of the Coney 2012 thing.
Dude, I totally forgot about
back
that.
in 2012.
Oh,
and that is a perfect example of this, where
I think
it was fake anyway. I think. Yeah. But I'm just saying, that's a great example of the concept of where people got so upset because, it's this horrible thing that's happening with this horrible, the military guy in Africa forcing all these children and whatever. And the thing that's so stupid about that is that, first of all, that causes us to be anxious and concerned and lose our trust in God. And then people's solution to that was, well, we need to your point, we need to then be God and go insert ourselves and solve the problem by throwing a bunch of money at it. And it turned out to be a lie anyway, but the point is, those kind of things. This is my point about why, like, the concern about the people being persecuted in China, or the way that North Korea is a horrible communist state, or things like that, are like, we can have a compassion for the people who are in those situations and understand that that's really sad and wrong what's happening in those places. But that's where we have to, that's my point about trusting, is to trust that God will, in his own way, intervene in whatever way he sees fit, or that if he's allowing it to happen, that some greater thing will come out of it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean it's okay. Just because God allows something to happen doesn't mean it's okay, but greater goods can come out of evil too.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it is true that in history, God has preordained specific people to do magnanimous things that radically change the world.
Absolutely.
Like Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King,
yep.
All right, President George Washington,
yep.
Plenty of saints. Like, that's great things, and God does use those people to go on and do great things. But those people went on to do great things because they didn't think that they were God.
Exactly.
For the saints, I can say that for certain. Okay, they didn't.
I mean, even George Washington, by all accounts, was pretty humble, and Martin Luther King seemed to be pretty humble. So,
yeah, like they didn't. Like, George Washington even had resistance to his call.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly.
So, right, that these people went on to be great because they didn't think to themselves, "It's up to me to save everyone."
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also, I'm reading very, very slowly Jordan Peterson's new book, We Who Wrestle with God, and he talks about. I'm still in the Garden of Eden, the fall sequence, and he talks about how I think he might get a little carried away with his interpretation of the scriptures here, but
sure.
Nonetheless, what he says is true, that he thinks that one of the issues with Eve is there's this thing about the mother that is, like, by nature compassionate, okay? Mm-hmm. And the compassionate mother likes to extend her love out to the fringes, okay? But if you overextend yourself to the fringes, and this is a point you've already made, but I'm just saying it differently, you sacrifice what's in the center. And Eve thinks, no, I can do this. I can eat this fruit. This thing is, like, it sounds evil, but, like, don't worry. Like, I can make it good. And I don't really think that's what that's why I think Dr. Peterson gets a little carried away. But nonetheless, what he's saying is true. It's this, and this is something we're really struggling with because we're so hyper aware, to your point, of all the evils of the world. We think to ourselves, I can fix them. Yeah. I can fix this. And then when we do that, we lose what's going on at home, right? We lose what we're actually given authority over by God. So, yeah.
And again, I think on a general level, this is a great example of why it's why I'm a monarchist at heart, and why I get so frustrated by, like, political things oftentimes, is because fundamentally in politics, in a democracy, what ends up happening? People think that the way to save, to your point about that whole example you just gave of Eve, most people don't actually think that they can save the world or the things themselves. But what they fall into is thinking that if they elect the right political leader, that political leader will save the world. And that's fundamentally, foundationally wrong. And then the other problem with that, to your point about the people who throughout history have been humble, who, like, rejected their calls or didn't want to do the thing or whatever, or reluctantly, I should say, reluctantly received a call, is that that's the other problem with the whole concept of electing leaders, is that 99% of the time, in order to get elected, you have to trumpet yourself as being this great person who's going to be the savior of everything and going to lead really well. And that's why oftentimes the people who probably would actually be the best leaders would be the more humble ones, the ones who wouldn't put themselves forward as a candidate to lead, but they never would get elected in a modern, democratic state or whatever.
I remember listening to a political commentator talking about, I think his name's Thomas, not the political commentator, but Thomas Sowell.
That name sounds really familiar.
He's an economist.
Okay.
And I remember the commentator, like, they were asking the guy, like, who do you think should run for president? He's like, oh, Thomas Sowell. But the reason I want him to run for president is because he's smart enough to know that he shouldn't. And yeah, to your point, like, the people who should be in charge are the ones who don't want to be in charge. And so it's unfortunately this corrupting process of election, the way things work. And so I see why you said now you're a monarchist at heart, which I have sympathies for sure. That to put yourself out there is by nature disordered. To say I can fix this. Yeah. It's if you ever, there's this Marvel show where they discuss, like, Captain America gets like the super serum and it makes him super powerful and strong. And there's this point later in the Marvel Cinematic Universe where they're discussing that by the very nature of desiring the super serum is supremacist. To desire to be like by desiring to think that you can be the hero, is already disposes you to not deserve it. Yeah. And they're like, what about Steve Rogers? He's a good person. Like, that's different. Like, but I think that's to your point. Like, to think that you can be the hero is like, well, shoot, you shouldn't be the hero then. But how else do you become the hero?
Which I think, sorry, now I'm getting into a minute distinction a little bit, but I think you can make a slight distinction between like a hero and a savior per se too.
For sure.
And I think what they're referring to, even though they're using the word hero, they're meaning something more like a savior.
Right.
Because I think that I would think of like the everyday hero in the sense that, a husband and father who gets up and sacrifices and goes to work and, is intentional about making sure that he spends time with his family and God and all those things. Like, that person is a hero in a certain sense.
We don't call them that, but they are a real hero.
And they should strive to be a hero in the sense of living virtue really well.
Right.
But not a savior in the sense of I'm going to go be the best and win everything and save everyone or whatever. So, yeah, exactly. No, I agree. Yeah.
So I guess the next step is what about – so taking Peterson's description of like the fringes, this is where it gets gray and difficult, is the people who are kind of a part of the community but kind of not. Or I know St. Thomas Aquinas says that a good sign of a dying nation is when the boundaries between communities become blurred. And I'm understanding that quote a little bit more now after our discussion, because it's like, okay, well, who do we care about then? Like, who do we care about, but who do we prioritize, right?
I
just use care like you did, but like, who do you prioritize in this situation? And you're like, it becomes so blurred and everything becomes so disordered. And like, that's where it gets difficult. That's where it gets really, really messy. And we see this in the United States. Like, is this a federal issue or a state issue? And then like, it's like I have no answer to that question. I think
the
the
default should be that in general it should be more state issues, but to the point of the hierarchy, it should go to states first. But that's just a general concept. Again, that's more of a principle thing than a specific scenario thing.
Yeah.
But that's exactly like that's where I think this is where we could kind of segue into the importance of understanding Catholic social teaching. So like I was rereading Rerum Novarum in preparation for this, Pope Leo XIII's encyclical from 1891, which still is kind of the foundational. It was rooted in the foundations of Scripture and how the Church had interpreted things for almost 2,000 years at that point. But it's still one of the most foundational like ways to understand Catholic social teaching. And I think we kind of get into these two kind of poles of this whole question, because you have the two things of how do we understand private property, which is a right and it's understood by the Church to be something that is permissible for us to have private property, but then also this concept that has been taught throughout the ages and centuries of the Church of what we have come to call the universal destination of goods.
Mm-hmm.
And the universal destination of goods essentially means that all, I think, as long as you can check me on this if I'm getting this wrong, but essentially it means that all goods, all things ultimately belong to God. And so therefore, in a certain manner, despite what I just said about private property, all things should belong to the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the goods
fundamentally.
The goods of creation are destined for the whole human race is the direct
exactly.
quote.
Yeah. So the goods of creation, that's a great one. Yeah, that's a good way to quote it. Yeah, the goods of creation are destined for the whole human race. And so therefore, all the created goods that we have are things that should be for the whole community. And so that's where they're sort of like two poles in a certain sense of this whole thing. And Catholic social teaching is almost like, here are the two poles. You have to try to figure out how to live those in the middle, sort of, because it allows you to have private property, which means that you can own and possess things of creation. But if all the things of creation are intended for the good of all, then how do you own and possess certain things?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to figure out that balance of marrying those. And that's where the hierarchy of love, the order of love, comes into this picture and can be what informs and helps us to understand how to marry those two things together. How do we use goods? How do we use those goods that are part of the universal destination of goods that belong to everyone?
Yeah.
How do we use them for the good of all within the hierarchy of love, and understanding that we can have private property for the sake of that hierarchy?
So I think a good way to paint the picture, you did a really good job. I think that's a really good explanation of how to synthesize the universal destination of goods and private property. You do that through looking at everything through the lens of the proper hierarchy of love. That makes a lot of sense. I think it's good to maybe cover the extremes of
Sure, yeah.
universal destination of goods and then the extremes of private property.
Yeah, and I think that's something that Leo the 13th, before it was even like it was at the beginning of when socialism and communism were starting to kind of become like a big thing when he wrote that encyclical.
Mm-hmm.
But that was one of the things that he was warning about, because a perfect example of going too far to the extreme of the universal destination of goods is understanding that no one should own anything.
Mm-hmm.
Everything should be owned in common with no private property. And so that becomes this sort of socialist communist state where some governmental body, whether it be, a state or a church or whatever, is the one who, in a certain sense, owns everything, but only for the purpose of distributing it evenly, because in the universal destination of goods, we all have a right to that thing, and so it should all be distributed perfectly and evenly.
Mm-hmm.
And then really, when you think about it, you could definitely make an argument, then this is why we've talked about this, I think, on the show a little bit before, about how Catholic social teaching is in the middle sort of socialism and capitalism, because you could kind of make an argument that the modern understanding of capitalism, when lived to the most extreme sense of it, is basically living on that extreme of private property, where there's no concept of universal destination of goods. It's all about, how can I use my capital best to serve me and my purposes, with no understanding of the fact that those things, that there is some obligation to my brothers and sisters in the community who also need to have capital to live.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you get into the whole thing of one of the things that Leo the 13th talks about in Rerum Novarum, and it gets reiterated in many encyclicals after that, is the importance of a just and a living wage, for example. Because what is a just wage? Sure, you can quibble about that, and there is no specific definition of that. But part of the point is that middle ground between the extremes of, capitalism, where you're obsessed with like extreme capitalism with all the private property and all that, and extreme socialism where there is no private property, is this understanding that somebody can own even a business, let's say, and they can make money off of that, and they can have private property through that, and they can have their income that they make, but they also have a requirement. It is actually required of them under the universal destination of goods to make sure that they are paying the people who work with them and for them a reasonable, just wage, so that those people can also have the basic necessities of life.
Yeah, I think you did a good job pointing out what the extremes would be. I remember hearing this quote from the church fathers. I forget which church father said it, but it was something along the lines of, if you have two coats, then you are a thief, because you only need one and the other coat belongs to your brother. Now, take that with nuance. I'm not saying if you have two coats, you're a sinful person, but I think what the quote is getting at is there are a lot of unnecessary material things that we do possess, especially, and this is where you kind of hinted at, the unhealthy extreme version of capitalism, where
Yeah.
it's way too much about private property, where you have too much stuff, and the question is, do you really need that, right? And this is where Karl Marx's critique of capitalism is pretty effective, where capitalism only works if people are constantly consuming.
Yeah.
And this is what we see with Apple. You know, they have a new iPhone every freaking year.
Yep.
They don't need a new iPhone every year. But nonetheless, the alternative, other extreme, is it kills a lot of people. Like it just doesn't work. The equal distribution of everything to everyone has never worked in any society whatsoever. And so the church has concluded that the right to private property is the way to guarantee and if you really care about world poverty, okay, right, putting forth the idea of private property is the best way to fight poverty. Yeah. And
Yeah.
as Jordan Peterson says, capitalism has eradicated or has set the most amount of people free from poverty, than any other economic system in the world. Doesn't mean it's perfect. I mean, we're acknowledging that. But
Yeah.
And the church doesn't really say it's perfect either. Right.
Oh gosh, no. The church is opposed to. Well, ultimately, the church is opposed to both capitalism and socialism. I know that's hard for a lot of Catholics to hear, but
it sees like capitalism's like this is kind of like the best there. This is what works the best in our fallen world.
It's what we're permitted to participate in. Yeah, like we would not be permitted to even participate in socialism.
Yeah. There's no such.
I think there's a distinction there. Yeah, the church says like capitalism is like, if lived properly and well, can be an acceptable means, but it's not ideal. Yeah. That's how the church, I think, would say it. Yeah. Versus socialism is just considered wrong, period, because there has to be the opportunity for at least owning some private property. Mm-hmm. And I think it's helpful to give people some examples of this. So, like, on a really basic, practical level, and you can go to two extremes, and I'll offer both because I think one of them is kind of a funny example, but also kind of true because it gets us thinking a little bit about private property and the universal destination of goods. Is so you as a husband and father realistically should have the ability to have a home of some sort, whatever that ends up looking like, whatever house or apartment or whatever. Although ideally you should actually be able to own a home, but there's a whole nother thing about part of the problem with the way capitalism is right now in this country at times is that it's hard for people to own homes. But you should be able to have a home and have certain property that you do own that belongs to you for the good of raising and protecting your family. And I think this is where, again, the hierarchy of love thing is so important because one of the things with the universal destination of goods is that the church does say that to your kind of thing about the church father, there is a church father who says that, and the church now actually even makes it clear that if someone has an excess of goods and someone else does not have enough goods to survive, that person who has an excess of goods is actually stealing from the person who does not have enough goods to survive. And that's something that's really hard for a lot of people to hear and a lot of people to think about. And I think it's an important thing for all of us to reflect on at times because we live in a capitalist society that, you know, for those who are able to do reasonably well, it can be hard sometimes to think about, you know, like, do I actually have too many things? Like, maybe I should give up a couple of those things. How does that work? Now, the other extreme to that, though, is understanding that just because someone has a right to have those basic necessities within the hierarchy of love, people also have the right to protect and safeguard their families. Mm-hmm. So that does not make it okay for the person who is in the lacking to steal to break, let's say, well, to use a very specific example to make the point that I'm making, to break into someone's home in order to steal the goods that they need, if that would potentially make that person's safety feel compromised in a certain way. And so I think that's something that is really important to like wrestle with and think about in this whole scenario because, you know, there's the classic example of Les Miserables, like the famous like play and movie where he steals some bread because he doesn't have enough bread or whatever, and he's put in prison. And the church actually says that if someone is genuinely starving and doesn't have any food, and someone else has enough food that they could share it, it is not considered stealing in the sense that it is not considered sinful for someone to take bread from someone else. Now, the only like caveat I think that can be made to that a little bit is understanding the thing about self-protection and preservation. And I think that's where we get into like interesting territory that I'd be curious of your reflections and thoughts on too.
Yeah, and before we jump into that, the ultimate problem with the extreme of the universal destination goods of communism and socialism is, as you said, it distorts the hierarchy of goods because it puts the community before actually everything
Correct.
else.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
And everyone likes to kind of glorify like those species, like those like the ants or the beehives, like they all sacrifice for the community. You know what I mean? And I'm like, and they view it as like this virtuous thing. And I understand when we live in a hyper individualistic culture, how that is super appealing, where everyone's just working for the community.
And we should sacrifice for the community, and we should love the community,
but not
not over our family,
not for the not
and
against
not over
the sake
God.
of the individual, the dignity of the individual, right?
Exactly.
And more explicitly the family. But yeah, honestly, I for the longest time was like, no, you just cannot steal. But since I've come to understand this idea of, well, no, they are actually taking something that is rightfully theirs. I think that makes complete sense to me. Now, that doesn't mean just because the person who's starving and is now just because someone is starving, though. I mean, actually, well, I don't know. What do you think? Like, just because someone is homeless and starving, that doesn't give them the green light to go and steal, right? What do you think?
So this is my point. This is
Right.
why I wanted to kind of discuss that, is because I think it's an interesting question that I don't think has a clear black and white answer. I think it depends on the situation and the scenario, because I think here's what I would give is sort of the principles on both sides in a certain sense. That on the one hand, the church would say that they do have a basic right to try to preserve their life, which could mean per se stealing something.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, this is where we get into the tricky scenarios of people living of like why it's important to actually live in a community too, because on the other hand, the person who you're stealing from also has a right to protection and to preserve their family. Now, it depends on the scenario of who you're stealing from too, in the sense of if so this is part of where it gets tricky, is if I am living relatively, let's say, right around my means, to use that example of people saying like living up to your means or whatever, but not like over them or whatever, or not, that's not even the right example. What I mean is, if I'm like kind of like just barely surviving, like I'm making just enough that like I'm able to support myself and my family, let's say I'm not even talking about right now, I'm talking about in a general scenario.
Yeah.
I'm making just enough to be able to basically support my family, and that's it. But we're not like, we don't have like a ton of lavish extra things. We're not like, super wealthy with all these extra things. A poor person who doesn't have any food does not necessarily have a right to steal from me in that scenario. Now, who they would have a right to steal from would be the millionaire who has lots of excessive food and clothing and cars and whatever. Now, here's the thing, though. This is where it gets tricky, and this is where we have to be careful, because I think especially when we have like young people listening, things like that, is to understand that these are principles we're talking about of a church sense of like, this is kind of the general principle behind these things. That does not mean that anyone should go out tomorrow and go, oh, well, I don't have enough food right now, or I don't have enough clothing that I would like, so I'm going to go steal. And especially something that I think has been really disturbing to me in recent years that has happened, and I think it's interesting because it's telling of kind of this whole fundamental understanding of humanity, is this thing that's happened a lot in recent years of stores having people stealing like small amounts from them. And because they won't prosecute you if you steal less than $1,000, I think it is, or something. Yeah. There's been this like rash of like a ton of grocery stores and Targets and places like that where people will just come in and just walk out with stuff.
Yeah.
And they'll claim that like, oh, well, I'm poor and this store is owned by these, this rich corporation or whatever. And so therefore I deserve this thing. And while some of that may even be true in principle, especially when you're talking about like rich corporations and stuff like that, fair enough, that does not necessarily justify that particular person going in and stealing in that particular scenario. And I think that's the thing where we have to be careful not to overdo the concept of the universal destination of goods for the sake of, oh, it's okay for me to steal because I'm stealing from this rich person or I'm stealing from this big corporation.
Yeah, I was happy you said that, because when you were talking about the people who, and it's just not even theft when the person has a right in the Les Miserables situation. Like, it's not theft. He's not stealing.
Correct.
He's getting what he needs. But the majority of the people who do use that principle are the people who are just they don't qualify for it whatsoever.
Exactly. That's my point.
And the thing is they need to remember, just because you're oppressed by that corporation, which is the case for probably the majority of Americans.
Correct.
Okay,
yeah.
Where we live in a capitalistic society with a lot of monopolies.
Yep. And a lot of corporations that are oppressing people and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So
and that doesn't mean, though, that I can, just because Amazon is making life difficult for me financially, doesn't mean I can just steal things from an Amazon warehouse. Yeah. So we have to, yeah, I'm happy you said that.
No, and I think a helpful measure with that is that it's helpful to think about something like the Les Mis example, where you were talking about somebody who is literally on the street, homeless, trying to survive with no food whatsoever. The people that I'm referring to who have been, the rash of stealing from all these stores and stuff in recent years, the vast majority of those people are not homeless people on the street. They're people like you or I who just aren't quite making enough at the job they're at or whatever, and they're trying to justify stealing. And oftentimes it's not even stealing like basic needs. It's like they're stealing, something that they want to make them happy or whatever, electronics or whatever. Yeah, exactly. And that's my point is just to be careful not to misunderstand that. We're not saying it's okay to do that. It's that there's very, very specific scenarios where it could be permissible, where it wouldn't be considered stealing, but that's only in those very specific scenarios. And that's also why it's so important for us to do charitable works. And that's why the church itself, the Catholic Church, sponsors so many charitable organizations. And I will say too, this is another important point to be made, I think, about the it not being theft thing. If a homeless person who can't eat a lot, or who doesn't have a lot of food, if they have a local soup kitchen that will give them a meal for free, they shouldn't be stealing from someone else.
Yeah, good.
That's an important distinction to draw as well. That, again, we're talking about like the absolute desperate scenario where there is no other alternative for some reason, then fair enough. But the universal destination of goods does not say, oh, well, it would be easier for me to walk into this store or break into this person's home or car and steal something than for me to go, walk a mile to the soup kitchen. Yeah, no, that doesn't work. Like, it's still stealing in that case, and you still shouldn't do it.
Well, and another element to even just make it even more complicated and unlikely that as someone would end up in that situation in this country, you can still imagine it being possible in certain situations, but the way the theft operates in most of these situations, it actually harms the person you're stealing from, because the person you're stealing from is a representation of the oppressor, but they're not the actual oppressor.
Exactly. That was my point about stealing from me versus the rich person.
Right. And so like I'm thinking, for example, like my dad is a real estate agent. Let's say there's a homeless person, okay? And according to the universal destination of goods, they should have a place to call home, right? But a bunch of people will squat, if you're familiar.
Yes, I am, unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example of it, of the problem. Yeah.
And it's like, okay, yeah, sure. According to the principle of the universal destination of goods, they should have some space that they could call home. But in order for them to actually enact that principle would require them to complicate someone else's life, like the actual owner of the home or the real estate agent who's in charge of selling that property. My dad has dealt with it many times, and it's very, very difficult. And my dad has a my dad is probably one of the biggest hearts I know for people who are homeless, and it tears him up. But it's very frustrating. And so Amazon, sure, maybe not a great company. I don't know. Okay, Target, probably not. But guess what? When you're stealing from them, or maybe you're trying to justify it, what are you doing to the people who are working in the store that day? What happens to the manager of that store? Did Target fires that manager possibly, right? And so it's very difficult to find, I think, for anyone to find themselves in the Les Miserables situation. Yeah, I'm thinking maybe in like very rural areas in the country.
Well, and
other than that,
I think this is why I always work from the top down, and why it's so important to understand that the purpose and the meaning of the universal destination of goods. I think a great way of looking at it, this is what I always comment on, is, and this is a huge distinction between what I'm about to share and socialism, is the way that the early church acted in the Acts of the Apostles, where they came together voluntarily and willingly as a community and shared most of their possessions and their belongings among each other as a community and dispersed them to the community. But here's the important key in that. It was done entirely voluntarily as part of those individual communities. It was not something that is forced upon them from above. And I think that's the fundamental thing. This is why this is so important with the hierarchy of love, because love, charity, caritas, as St. Thomas Aquinas would talk about it, love willing the good of the other is charity. Mm-hmm. And true charity has to be done freely. And so it can't be forced upon you. That's why even the concept of the universal destination of goods can't be forced upon someone, in the sense that, and this is where I'm going with this, is that in the sense of, oh, well, I don't have this thing I want, so I'm going to force someone else. I'm going to force you, Reese, to participate in the universal destination of goods by stealing from you.
Right.
That's not acceptable in that scenario. Like that's again where we have to be careful of. That's why everything should be informed by love and by charity and by willing the good of the other. Our actions should always be, this is where, in moral thought, any action, and this is one of the problems today with, we do things so reactionarily without actually stopping and thinking, but any action we're going to take should be thinking, what is the implications of this action? How does this impact myself? Kind of like the hierarchy that we're talking about. How does this impact God? How does this impact myself? And how does this impact others? Love of God, love of self, and love of neighbor. And that's something that we forget so often in these scenarios, because, just because I need to preserve my life, and that's good, and there could be a moment where it might be okay and not even stealing to take food in the Les Miserables example, but just because that's one example versus I want this thing and I don't have the money to afford it because this evil corporation is quote unquote oppressing me or whatever, does not then mean that I can then go and negatively impact you, Reese, in order to steal that thing.
Right. Well, and to make it even more complicated, is my number one one of my main critiques of utilitarianism, because it judges the morality of an action based off of its impact, is we actually, by nature, because we are finite beings, can never be completely aware of the impact of our actions.
Well, yeah, exactly.
And so it's like you got to be in like the prime situation to grab something that is yours when it looks like theft.
And I think that's another example of, I think you can, I'm not going to put this one out there as declaratively, but I'm going to reason this out, and I think this makes sense. I would argue that even the example of stealing from the big corporation, the store or whatever, that you might think that, oh, well, they're a big corporation and so they can handle it,
right,
and they suck anyway, and I need this thing. But to your point about not always understanding how your actions can impact others, even whether this is good or not is irrelevant. If you stealing from the corporation causes them to then react in such a way that they make things harder to get for everyone else, that's also a negative consequence of your action.
Would the
that you
principle
should keep in mind potentially.
would the
I
princi-
think
would the principle of the double effect kick in right there?
it depends
I
on
still
whether
think-
yes, it would if you stealing was okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Only
that
yeah.
in that case, it wouldn't be stealing because you would have the right to the thing.
Right.
But
right.
but I'm talking. That's why I keep using the word stealing. Is I'm talking about the scenario where you're justifying stealing based on your rationale
right.
versus the Les Miserables example is not considered stealing.
Right. Yeah. That was just a weird question.
No, that's a
Yeah,
good
yeah,
point.
yeah,
That the
yeah.
principle of double effect would probably apply because it wasn't the intended consequence.
And that's
of the
and that's
action.
probably what justifies the action overall. It's probably the church's logic behind, or it's an element of the church's logic. It's according to the universal destination of the goods, this belongs to this person, and so taking something that belongs to them is good. That's a good or neutral action, and even if it does have, in a sense, a slightly negative consequence, where instead of 10 loaves they have 9 loaves, that's still the good of feeding the person who's about to die would outweigh.
Well, so not to muddy the waters more, but my
Great.
understanding from doing some research leading into this too is that the church's actual teaching on the universal destination of goods and private property is that you said that person owns the thing.
Or they don't.
I think the church would say that if someone has excessive things, they actually don't own certain things.
Right. Yeah.
So that's where that's part of why that's the reasoning behind why the person who is in the genuine Les Miserables position, where they feel that where they need to like take the bread from someone else who has it to survive. That's why they would not. Let's say, for example, that you were a millionaire, billionaire, and you had all this food in plenitude, and I am, average Joe Schmo who is barely getting by. They would not have the right to take food from me because that food still belongs to me in that scenario. But you, as someone who is overly exceedingly wealthy, don't have the right to actually own all of that stuff because the church would say, and this is where it gets really weird, you are actually stealing from others by having an excess of things.
Yeah, which is a concerning teaching, but for the state of like our souls. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it's hard because that's something that I think we all that was my point about something that we all have to reflect on.
Yeah.
Is to recognize like, is my having of X, Y, or Z, and I'm not saying we need to be overly scrupulous and think about it with every single thing we possess,
Right.
but there is some degree to which, do I need the 12th pair of shoes or the, 15th sweater or whatever, like it comes down to this kind of question of like, how many of those things do you actually need? And how many of those things are you potentially stealing from someone that should have them and you shouldn't be spending that money? And to your point about, and this is one of the dangers of capitalism I will give you, is the consumerist thing, because our inclination is we should spend the money that we have. That's part of the consumerist mindset. And so therefore that means that we're more likely to just have a bunch of things that we maybe don't actually always need.
Yeah. No, that's. Yeah, and it's weird too because you think about all the things that you do have. I was like, wait, how many of the things that I have I actually bought? A handful, like a significant number of the materials that I own, air quotes, have been given to me as gifts. And so, and it's like, well, there's nothing wrong with accepting gifts. So what if you have excessive gifts? Well, then you should probably give some away.
Well, yeah, no, once you've received a gift, you owned it at that point, I think you would say, and so.
Right.
It's still the same principle still applies.
But it's like we're so obsessed also with physical gift giving, like material gift giving, and that's another thing that just just muddies the water a little bit more in this situation.
Well, yeah, and that's part of the consumerist society we live in, though,
yeah.
too, is that there's this encouragement that we always have to give physical gifts, which drives me insane. But yeah.
Well, Peter, we're 2 hours and 13 minutes.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
Yeah.
This is like one of our longest episodes.
Yeah.
All right, we should wrap this up.
All right.
Do you want to just I can just summarize things real quick? Or
you or me?
I can. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you want.
Go ahead, dude. Yeah.
I mean, I think just to kind of bring it all back to summarize, basically the three main principles to take away from this is the hierarchy or order of love, of how we should love, the universal destination of goods, and the right of private property. And I guess the kind of thing that's important to remember with all of those is that all of them have to be rooted in that fundamental sense of love as charity, as willing the good of the other for the sake of the other, directed toward the good, which in this case, the good is God. That we should love God first. As Jesus said, love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself, which means loving yourself, then love family, love your community, love your state and nation. And then within that context and that hierarchy, that's what informs our understanding of how do we live out this right to private property and the universal destination of goods.
Excellent summary, Peter. Good. Okay. Well, that was a heck of an episode.
Yeah, it was great. If anybody has any questions about any of those things, I know there's a lot of meat in there and a lot of things. You can always email us at, what is it? I think it's Of Mountains and Men podcast at Gmail.
Yeah. I think I have it linked to
yeah, I think you do. So
Spotify or something.
Yeah, just send us any questions. I know there's a lot in there and a lot of interesting topics. And let us know if there's something you want us to talk about, or if you're one of Reese's students, tell him if you have something you want us to talk about. So, yeah, and hopefully we'll have a couple guests on coming up soon. I think we might be potentially lining that up. So
that'd be sweet.
Yeah, this has been Of Mountains and Men. I'm Peter.
I'm Reese. Stay golden.